Hello, I'm Sam Bilton, food historian, writer, and cook. I'm delighted to be invited by the Ginger and Spice Festival team to give you a brief overview of the history of gingerbread. Market Drayton is famous for its gingerbread, but the history of this story was getting lost. So several years ago, the Ginger and Spice Festival was created. The purpose of this event was to bring together the local community and to rediscover and celebrate their unique culinary and cultural heritage, as well as promote and champion their local produce in town. If you want to bake some Market Drayton gingerbread yourself, I have posted a recipe over on my Instagram account at Mrs. Bilton with 2 S's. It's from Meg Pybus's book on the town's culinary heritage called Under the Buttercross. Ordinarily, the festival takes place in Market Drayton over an entire weekend, but due to the COVID pandemic, the organisers are taking a slightly different approach this year. That said, there have been a number of activities held today, including live music at the Buttercross and a spicy street market. Fingers crossed the festival will return to its more extensive format next year. Hopefully, you all have a cup of tea and some gingerbread to nibble on during the presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions you have at the end. Gingerbread is probably one of the first things children learn to make. We love to make it into figures influenced by the tale of the gingerbread boy on the run from his parents and various farm animals. Then there are the gingerbread houses, frosted with icing and bedecked in sweets, which have become popular at Christmas, although they bear little resemblance to the original witch's house in the story of Hansel and Gretel, which supposedly inspired them. But what is it about this simple combination of flour, sugar, treacle, and spice that makes this confection so alluring? Is it the spicy aroma permeating the kitchen as it bakes, or the tingly heat it gives off when you eat it, or merely the element of fun provided by different gingerbread shapes? One thing is certain, gingerbread has been beloved of the young and old for generations. Queen Victoria even gave her dog Dash some gingerbread at Christmas. As a result, it has a long and sometimes surprising history, as we shall see. If I were to ask you to define gingerbread, what would you say? Should it be crisp like a biscuit or spongy like a cake? Should it include treacle, golden syrup, honey, or just sugar? In terms of spicing, is ginger really essential? The fact of the matter is that gingerbread takes on many forms, so it's actually quite difficult to give a definitive answer. This is a description provided by the Oxford Companion to Food. Normally suggests there are exceptions to the rule. In the British Isles alone, there are considerable differences between regional gingerbreads. According to cook Nigel Slater, it would be wooden spoons at dawn if any single place tried to claim gingerbread as their own. In the north, the oak-based parkin is popular, particularly on the 5th of November, when the gunpowder plot of 1605 to blow up Parliament in King James I is commemorated with bonfires and fireworks. Further south, towns like Market Drayton in Shropshire produce a crisper, more biscuity sort of gingerbread. Before the Second World War, one of Market Drayton's gingerbread makers, Billington's, used to sell port wine alongside their gingerbread, which was reputedly good for dunking in this fortified beverage. One of the earliest examples of a written recipe for gingerbread dating from the 15th century has a curious absence of ginger. And in Wales, they have a cake which translates as ginger cake without ginger. So it seems ginger wasn't necessarily an essential ingredient. In fact, on the continent, ginger is often omitted from spice biscuits, which come under the banner of gingerbreads. In Sweden, for example, cardamom and pepper are often favoured over ginger as a flavouring. The other curious thing about early British gingerbreads is the use of breadcrumbs and honey, rather than flour and treacle or syrup. They were also dried rather than baked in an oven. These confections were decorated with a fleur-de-lis made with 3 box leaves and a clove. Sometimes it would be gilded, and on other occasions it was coloured red with sanders, which comes from the wood of the red sandalwood tree. While researching the book, I tried to make, to my mind, I tried to make an authentic gingerbread, medieval gingerbread. All I can say is that the texture, to my mind, well, let's just say it was an acquired taste. Recipes from the late 16th and early 17th centuries sometimes included ingredients like wine and licorice, which weren't really to my liking. Suffice to say, I didn't include a modern version of either of these in my book, but there is a recipe for a honey tart which contains most of the ingredients used by medieval cooks. So where did gingerbread originate? Well, the truth is, nobody really knows. Spices were certainly revered by ancient civilizations across the world. Ginger has had a reputation for maintaining health and well-being in China for centuries. The Chinese philosopher Confucius is said to have eaten ginger at every meal. But finding evidence of spice cakes eaten in the ancient world is a little harder to pinpoint. We know from the works of writers like Athenaeus and Cato that cakes soaked in honey were eaten in the ancient world, and in the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology, honey cakes were served at lavish feasts, indicating they may also have been eaten by the Celts. While a book on cakes is curiously absent from the culinary manuscripts accredited to the ancient Roman gourmet Marcus Gavius Apicius, there are a few sweet recipes in the surviving books, including this dulcia piperata, a honey and nut cake spiked with pepper that I've recreated in the book. Another theory is that the gingerbreads descend from the Chinese honey bread called mikong, which was carried into battle by Genghis Khan's troops. The Arabs and Turks inherited a taste for these sweet, energy-giving breads from the Mongols and in turn passed them on to the Crusaders. 13th century abbot Arnold of Lubeck refers to this honey bread as panis mellitos, but again, there is no mention of spices. However gingerbread came about, it certainly proved to be very popular, particularly among the aristocratic elite. Spices, you see, were incredibly expensive. Serving dishes cooked with spices and often sprinkled on top as a garnish was a way to demonstrate your wealth. And what better way to showcase a whole collection of spices than in gingerbread? But gingerbread wasn't only popular because it tasted good. It seems it may have begun life with a bit of a loose reputation. Perhaps the inspiration for gingerbread came more from the apothecary than the bakehouse. In theory, just about any ailment could be cured by consuming a combination of spices, herbs, honey, and any number of less palatable ingredients. Spices in particular, with their hot and dry nature, endeared themselves to remedies for sexual issues. Spices, and especially ginger, were thought to be aphrodisiacs. Any food infused with spices would be in danger of inflaming passion, or in the cases of impotence, restoring it. Add hot and moist sugar into the equation and you are asking for trouble. This puts a completely different spin on the practice of serving spiced wines at medieval weddings rather than just toasting the happy couple's health. In the Elizabethan era, ginger's hot nature was believed to provoke sluggish husbands. It was also believed to sharpen the eyesight and combat flatulence, I should say. It was during this period that a special event after the formal feast in large households known as the banquet became popular. This was frequently served in a separate room, building, or even on the roof, a post-dinner after-party, if you like. It was an opportunity to flirt outrageously beyond the wagging tongues of the servants. Invitations to the host banquet were usually only extended to a select few. Gradually, this trend would filter down the social scale, and soon banqueting houses gained a somewhat ribald reputation. These events attracted the ire of a 16th century pamphleteer called Philip Stubbs. In his work, The Anatomy of Abuses, Stubbs railed against aspects of popular culture that he believed were immoral and in need of reform if his fellow countrymen and women were to escape the punishment of God. The subjects that came under criticism included visiting prostitutes, lending money at interest, drunkenness and gluttony, as well as the wearing of fancy clothing, the variety of hats available, attending the theatre, playing sports and dancing. He sounds like an absolute barrel of laughs, doesn't he? This is what he had to say on the subject of banqueting houses. In the suburbs of the city, women have gardens either paled or walled round about very high, with their harbours and bowers fit for the purpose. Unless they be espied in these open places, they have their banqueting houses with galleries, turrets, and whatnot therein sumptuously erected, wherein they may, and doubtless do, many of them, play the filthy persons. The treats served at a banquet were laden with sugar and spices. The purpose was to demonstrate confectionery skills of the provider, as well as being a display of wealth. These luscious tidbits were designed to tantalise and titivate all manner of the senses in order to promote the hot and moist humours of lust. It should also be noted that at this time, gingerbread was also known as a cake that could comfort the stomach. Even today, products containing ginger, such as ginger nut biscuits, which my midwife recommended to quell morning sickness, are thought to have a calming effect on the tummy. Gingerbread would remain a treat for festivals and special occasions for many years to come. But a slick, dark player by the name of treacle was about to enter the stage and change gingerbread's fortunes forever. In the ancient world, if you were bitten by an animal or perhaps a venomous snake, you would probably send for some theoraca antidotos, literally the antidote for the bite of a wild beast. It is from this phrase that we get the word treacle. The Roman Emperor Nero's physician Andromachus applied this term to a mixture of honey, spices, and drugs as a cure-all for venomous bites and poisons. This concoction was still available in the Middle Ages as theoraca or treacle from apothecaries and treaclemongers. Venetian treacle, an elixir reputedly made to Andromachus's very own recipe, was most costly. Venetian treacle would eventually be usurped by a new elixir called London treacle, which used cheap molasses rather than honey as its base. Treacle or molasses is a byproduct of the sugar refining process. So you can see how the association of treacle as a medicine would explain why it was slow to be adopted as a culinary ingredient. Poisoning was something of an occupational hazard for the medieval elite. The French king Charles VII chose the beautiful Agnes Sorel to be his mistress around 1444. Agnes is probably most famous for her daring dress sense. She popularised the trend of wearing dresses that expose one or both breasts, which has been immortalised in paintings such as this. Charles was absolutely devoted to her, so perhaps understandably their close relationship caused a fair amount of jealousy at court, particularly on the part of the king's son Louis, who was none too keen on his father's mistress. So when she died suddenly in 1450, rumours began to spread that she had been poisoned by the Dauphin. Evidently, Agnes loved gingerbread, pain d'épices as it is known in France. One theory is that Louis sent her a poisoned batch to orchestrate her demise. In 2004, Agnes's body was exhumed, and significant amounts of mercury in her hair have led historians to conclude that she probably did die from poisoning. However, who poisoned her or how it was delivered remains a mystery. Controversy continued to surround gingerbread in France into the 16th century. During the reign of the French King Henry II, gingerbread would again be tainted by rumours of poison when talk spread that the Italians were doctoring their beloved pain d'épices with toxic substances. It would not regain favour at the French court again until the reign of Louis XIV. In England, treacle's transformation from medicine to food came about largely due to the country's colonial expansion during the 17th century. Early English settlers in the Caribbean tried growing crops such as cotton and tobacco with some success, but it was sugar that helped make them rich. Colonialists from all over Europe soon realised that the climate in the Caribbean and the Americas was suited to growing sugar. Sugar exports from Barbados alone in the late 1640s were worth £3 million, making it England's wealthiest colony. Initially, New World sugar was refined in the Low Countries, but from 1544, England began refining its own sugar. This meant that treacle could be produced on home soil. As England's colonial interest expanded, so the price of sugar and treacle would come down. As well as medicine, treacle was used to distill rum. But as the production of treacle outstripped the demands of the apothecaries, and distillers, it was sold as a cheap, unmedicated sweetener known as common treacle, later simplified to treacle. It was not long before honey was usurped by sugar or treacle in gingerbread recipes. Robert May's gingerbread recipe from The Accomplished Cook of 1685 clings to the habit of using breadcrumbs and ground almonds, but these are combined with sugar and spices rather than honey. In the 1705 edition of the Family Dictionary, William Salmon records that a gingerbread was made for King Charles II, containing 3 pounds of treacle, half a pound each of candied orange, lemon, and citron peel, plus 2 ounces of coriander seeds, and enough flour to make a paste. So where could you get hold of some gingerbread if you weren't lucky enough to have your own cook to bake some for you? By the end of the 17th century, confectionery shops were springing up in large cities like London, which sold, among other things, gingerbread. Recipes for gingerbread also appear in cookbooks, particularly those aimed at the middle classes, and household recipe books like this one from the recipe book of Anne Blencow. Anne, who was born in 1656, appears to have begun keeping a collection of recipes shortly after her marriage to John Blencow, a judge and later Member of Parliament for Brackley, Northamptonshire. The book has remained in the possession of their descendants. But the place where you were most likely to find gingerbread was your local fair. The ancestry of the fair can be traced back to the medieval era, when the right of a town to hold a fair was granted by royal charter. The aim of these charters was to provide revenue for the crown by way of an annual fee payable to the city or the town, payable by the city or the town. Between 1199 and 1350, over 1,500 charters were issued across England to towns like Ormskirk in Lancashire, which is renowned for its gingerbread. The main focal point of most fairs was commerce in terms of buying or selling livestock or hiring labourers. But whatever the purpose of the fair, those in attendance would still require refreshment. In Ben Jonson's 17th century play Bartholomew Fair, there is a hog roast available, a man selling trinkets, puppeteers, and a lady selling gingerbread. Gingerbread has been synonymous with fairs for hundreds of years. It was considered good luck to eat a piece of gingerbread bought at a fair. Known as fairings, they could be moulded into different shapes and were often gilded. In Cornwall, a proper and complete fairing was a spicy ginger biscuit adorned with lamb's tails, candied angelica, almond comfits, and macaroons. Fear not, the tails in question were actually caraway seeds coated in coloured sugar. Bakers of yesteryear kindly left us numerous wooden artefacts detailing the figures and shapes that were popular for gingerbread. The significance of some of these moulds is more obvious than others. For example, many pictured famous or patriotic figures like the Duke of Wellington sitting on his horse. Royalty was clearly a popular subject, although sometimes the same design could be utilised for different monarchs, making it tricky to date some moulds. In the early 19th century, a gilded King George on horseback was popular and was eaten with great relish by his juvenile subjects. The oddest mould I have come across is that of a chicken wearing trousers, which you can see in this picture. Apologies for the poor copy of the image, but it was taken through a display case. This is currently on display at Horsham Museum with a number of less unusual gingerbread moulds. I was unable to unearth the significance or meaning of this image, so if you have any clues, please let me know. Aside from famous personages moulded in gingerbread, there were also generic human shapes sold at fairs and confectioners known as gingerbread husbands. Gingerbread husbands seem to have been particularly popular in the southern counties of England. The Chelmsford Chronicle, for instance, on the Friday 14th of May 1847, reports of the spring fair that there were upon the stalls rows of gingerbread husbands for the little ladies, and on the pavement rows of gentlemen for the larger ones, looking almost as gay, if not quite as soft and tender. Sometimes the gingerbread gentleman would be carrying a stick or an umbrella, and they were often decorated with touches of gold. Founder of the Folk Cookery Association, Florence White, comments, "Just imagine a child's joy in the gingerbread husband and her grief when the gilt wore off." It was particularly accustomed to buy a gingerbread husband on Valentine's Day. Gingerbread wives were also available available and are mentioned by John Keats in reference to Dawlish Fair, as well as John Newbery in his 1764 children's story, The Fairing. However, after the Great War, it was very hard to find gingerbread spouses anywhere for sale in the country. Now, there has been some debate as to whether the gingerbread figures have a more sinister heritage. I did read one article where the authors claimed the gingerbread man can be traced back to the sacrifice of prisoners, knights and foot soldiers. The claim was that baked effigies were painted in the enemy's blood, and this is why gingerbreads are ornamented in red. Personally, I could find no evidence to support this theory, although the English did have a penchant in the past for using effigies, edible or otherwise, to denigrate particular groups of people or individuals. In England, on the 1st of March, St. David's Day, it used to be the custom to hang or burn effigies of Welshmen, much in the same way the British still do with guys on the 5th of November. This was witnessed by the 17th century diarist Samuel Pepys, who described seeing an effigy of a man dressed like a Welshman hanging by the neck upon one of the poles outside a merchant's house. He describes it as being in full proportion and very handsomely done, although he does concede that it was an odd sight. At some point, the effigy switched from being made of straw to the more innocuous gingerbread. This satirical drawing from 1786 is actually poking fun at the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, and his mistress, Maria Fitzherbert, but it gives you an idea of the sort of image that may have been created in gingerbread. The skewer was inserted so that children had something to hold on to. The description of white parliament implies the figures may have been made from almond paste, rather like marzipan, or possibly a paler sugar-based gingerbread like those produced in Grantham in Lincolnshire. Although the initial purpose of the fair was business, there was also an element of fun attached to these events. Bartholomew Fair at Smithfield in London, which was established in the 12th century, originally lasted for 3 days over the Feast of St. Bartholomew on the 24th of August. By many fairs, it had been conceived to sell cattle and merchandise, particularly cloth. By the time Ben Jonson wrote the play of the same name in the 17th century, the emphasis had shifted from commerce to pleasure. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the fair would become a 14-day event that was opened by the Lord Mayor of London. Bartholomew Fair and almost every other fair gained a reputation for being exceptionally rowdy, with freak shows like the Pig-Faced Lady and performing animals joining the fray. West Smithfield was nicknamed Ruffian's Hall because it was renowned for fights. The fair became so disreputable during the 17th century that Queen Anne ordered it to return to a 3-day event. A stallholder in Ben Jonson's play, Lanthorn Leatherhead, accuses fellow vendor, aptly named Joan Trash, of selling gingerbread progeny made with stale bread, rotten eggs, musty ginger and dead honey, despite Trash's protestations that her gingerbread is made with nothing but what's wholesome. Leatherhead is not the only person to criticise Trash. Puritan pastor Zela the Lamb Busy accuses her of peddling a basket of popery, thy nest of images and whole legend of gingerwork. Convinced that the fair and its attractions create sinful intentions fueled by, among other things, Joan's spicy gingerbread, Busy overturns her basket. I'm guessing the good pastor had no interest in attending those intimate banquets I mentioned earlier. But the stallholders have the last laugh when Busy is put in the stocks for preaching at the fair. Despite Queen Anne's hopes that Bartholomew Fair would become less rowdy if its duration was shortened, it became increasingly lawless. On one September morning alone in 1815, 45 felonies were reported at the fair. Consequent public outcry saw the great carnival diminished to a few wild beast shows and a handful of gilt gingerbread booths. By 1840, Bartholomew Fair was a shadow of its former self. After more than 700 years, the final Bartholomew Fair was held in 1855. Joan Trash may well have been fictitious, but gingerbread vendors could be renowned characters. Probably the most famous of these was the 18th century gingerbread seller known as Tiddy Doll, who was dubbed the king of itinerant tradesmen. Tiddy Doll acquired his nickname for his penchant of singing a little catchy ditty using the words Tiddy Diddy Doll, which I am not going to offend your ears by attempting to sing myself today. He made bold statements about his gingerbread, claiming it would melt in your mouth like a red-hot brick bat and rumble in your inside like Punch in his wheelbarrow. Little is known of the true identity or life of Tiddy Doll, but whoever he was, he certainly made a lasting impression, and he continued to capture the imagination of artists and writers well into the 19th century. Tiddy Doll was featured in the 18th century prints like The Idle Apprentice, executed at Tyburn by William Hogarth. You can see the gingerbread vendor in the bottom right-hand corner, brandishing his wares, complete with ruffled shirt, white apron and a feathered hat. Presumably, gingerbread was a popular snack to nibble on at this form of public entertainment. In 1806, the satirical caricaturist James Gilray would use Tiddy Doll as the model for his depiction of Napoleon, with an emphasis on the feathered tricorn, as the great French gingerbread maker shoveling gingerbread kings and queens into an oven. Radical 19th century writer and journalist Thomas Frost claimed that Tiddy Doll was so well known that on one occasion, when the vendor was missing for a week from his usual stand in the Haymarket, a pamphlet which included an account of his alleged murder was sold in the streets by the thousands. In reality, Tiddy had merely decided he fancied a change of scenery and had left London for a week to tout his wares at a country fair. However, it does appear that Tiddy Doll wasn't popular with everyone. On the 17th of June 1752, the paper The True Briton announced that the famous gingerbread seller had been found murdered in Chelsea's field. His assailants made off with £20, a considerable sum in the 18th century. For many, the ability to sell food on the streets was a godsend. An Irish sailor called Daniel Clary began selling gingerbread nuts after the loss of his legs during an engagement on the salt seas. Clary's gimmick was to sell gingerbread nuts by way of lottery. Endowed with the gift of the gab, Clary assured his customers that his lottery was no South Seas bubble. As there were no blanks in Clary's game, every player would win and receive a prize. Clary boasted that some of his gingerbread shop were so highly seasoned that they were as hot as the noble Nelson's balls when he last peppered the jackets of England's foes. A bit of banter certainly oiled the wheels of commerce. But perhaps I should take a moment to explain a little about old-style gingerbread nuts. One of the things that has always perplexed me about ginger nuts is how they got their name. The modern ginger nut recipe is based on a mixture of golden syrup, granulated sugar, combined with flour, butter and ginger. No nuts are usually harmed in the making of the ginger nut biscuit. Nigel Slater describes them as being crisp, hot and addictive, and as hard as a brick. I certainly agree with the addictive comment, and they are probably one of my favourite biscuits. And it appears I am not alone. Although sales of ginger nuts have fallen in recent years, they remain one of the country's most popular everyday biscuits. Its firm nature does make it great for dunking in a cup of tea, which may explain why the ginger nut's popularity has endured. However, in the 18th and 19th century, gingerbread nuts would take on a slightly different form. They were still hard. In fact, some recipes I tried were proper teeth breakers. The nut reference relates to the size and shape of the biscuit, which was usually rolled into a ball the size of a walnut. Unfortunately, some recipes produced a more forgiving biscuit. Fortunately, rather, some recipes produced a more forgiving recipe, like these hunting nuts from Mary Ann Dixon, wife of the Royal Dean of York. Her recipe dates from the mid-19th century. They've been described as travelling biscuits, possibly due to their durable nature or the fact that ginger was believed to be good to quell nausea. But back to Daniel Cleary and his gingerbread lottery. The lottery took the form of a box with strings attached to the bottom. For half a penny, you pulled a string and a doll's head would appear in one of the variously numbered 27 holes. If you had chosen the same number that the doll appeared in, you would win 100 gingerbread nuts. If not, you were still rewarded with at least 7 gingerbread nuts. Ever the self-assured salesman, Clary had no qualms in stating that his nuts were far superior to those of the famous Tiddy Doll. In fact, his wares were so fine that should any one of his noble friends prove fortunate enough to draw a prize of 100 of them, he would be entitled to those of half the usual size, so delicately small they would be no bigger than the quack doctor's pills. I'm not entirely sure the customer was getting a good deal here. However, the gingerbread lottery must have been fairly commonplace, as it was frequently mentioned in the popular musical comedies of the day. Tiddy Doll and Dan Clary may have espoused the virtues of their goods, but often the quality of the gingerbread was in question. An article in Punch from 1845 on the revival of the Brook Green Fair sums up how the attractions of the salesperson could potentially distract from the quality of the goods being sold, in which the author declares, "Poor maiden, thought the youth, if thou wert sent with thy long curls and low-necked blandishment to wake attention to thy canvas mart of gingerbread, thou little knows the art, although thy lips counsel sweetly, buy, those nuts look far too dusty, stale and dry." With the exception of Tiddy Doll's success, it seems that selling gingerbread was not a lucrative business, with some commentators believing it reaped little financial reward as the profits were generally spent on gin and hot suppers. I've even read articles from the 19th century of gingerbread sellers being accused of picking pockets of fairgoers who refused to buy their wares. Of course, you didn't have to take part in a lottery or go to the fair to get your fix of gingerbread. Confectioners across the country made and sold gingerbread all year round. You may remember Mr. Dick in Miss David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, who was very partial to gingerbread, but was only allowed to purchase 1 shilling's worth a day from the local cake shop. These artisans were very protective of their recipe. The original recipe, developed by Sarah Nelson in 1855 for grass-made gingerbread, is still kept in a safe to this day. And as late as the 1950s, Bill Cox, owner of Chester's Prize Gingerbread in Market Drayton, would tell a local journalist that no one is allowed to be about when I am making gingerbread. Even towns which weren't renowned for a specific type of gingerbread could support a number of purveyors of this confection. For example, in the small market town of Horsham in Sussex, where I grew up, they had 10 gingerbread makers in the mid to late 19th century. Confectioners like Abraham Chatfield, whose shop you can just see in the bottom right-hand corner of this old picture, would have his gingerbread and brandy snaps delivered to the villages surrounding the town by pony and cart. Gingerbread was sold at the last execution to take place in Horsham, when John Lawrence was publicly hanged for the murder of priest superintendent Mr. Solomon. The spectacle attracted sightseers and peddlers from miles around. In a slightly morbid twist to the tale, the murderer's body was exhumed when Horsham Jail was demolished in 1845 and exhibited at the stables of the Queen's Head public house at a price of 2p for admission, but I don't believe the tickets included a piece of gingerbread. So what of gingerbread today? We've already seen by the dawn of the 20th century, the gilded gingerbread figures of yesteryear were beginning to disappear from fairs or being replaced with newfangled confections like candy floss. The fairs themselves began to change with greater emphasis on steam-powered merry-go-rounds. In 1924, the English novelist Sheila K. Smith wrote of the stalls at the fair being of a more utilitarian nature, selling things like balls of string rather than ribbons and gingerbread. The Great War had a profound effect on all aspects of British culture and was probably the final nail in the coffin for the classically moulded gingerbreads. In 1917, the last Horsham gingerbread baker, George Lovekin, died. Fortunately, his moulds eventually made their way to Brighton Museum, so they have been preserved for posterity and are currently on display in Horsham Museum. Other towns fared a little better. Gingerbread, for example, is still being made in towns like Market Drayton and Ormskirk, ensuring that their town's gingerbread tradition is being preserved. But despite the social and economic challenges, gingerbread has never entirely disappeared from our lives. Although Florence White feared the charm of England's cookery was being completely crushed out of existence by the nation's fascination for foreign food, gingerbread has stubbornly clung on and continues to appear in recipe books today. There are even people out there writing entire books devoted to the subject. You may not be able to buy gingerbread at a fair today, but you can visit entire cities made of gingerbread, like this one created by the Museum of Architecture in London at the end of 2019. Some towns go all out to celebrate their gingerbread heritage, such as Market Drayton with its Ginger and Spice Festival, and Ormskirk, which hosts an annual gingerbread festival. And all is not lost for Horsham, thanks to Leslie Ward, who has created a gingerbread based on a recipe she found in a book belonging to a member of the Shelley family. Well, that's all for me today. Thank you very much for listening. I've only really touched on the surface of gingerbread's long and auspicious history in Britain, but you can read more about it in my book. However, if you do have any questions and you would like to ask, please get in touch or let's have a chat at the end of this presentation. In the meantime, happy dunking. And please do take a look at the Ginger and Spice Festival website, where you can find details of their podcast and their Spice Larder store. Thank you.